Let's dive right into this explainer on deaf history, faith, and the Jamaica Deaf Village. To really get Jamaica, you've got to understand its spiritual roots. It's this incredibly powerful mashup of West African traditions and Christian influences that date all the way back to the slavery era. Take the 19th century, for example. Native movements like revivalism sprang up, and the people made it crystal clear. They absolutely were not going to let European missionaries just dictate their faith. No way. Instead, they took Christian elements and blended them with deep African practices, think intense physical movement and rhythmic drumming, so they could worship entirely on their own terms. And we actually see this intense push for independence in early African Jamaican traditions like Maoism. They used vibrant community gatherings, singing and dancing as a literal spiritual defense against what they saw as evil. Now, this deep, deep historical pride, this burning desire to express faith in their own unique way, is absolutely crucial to keep in mind. We really have to grasp this spirit of self-determination if we're going to understand another historically marginalized group in Jamaica, and that is the deaf community.
Which brings us to part one, the silent oppression.
So, for centuries, deafness was virtually invisible in the history books because it wasn't a visible physical trait, right? So, deaf individuals were often entirely excluded from society. And yeah, excluded from the church, too. Historically, the world viewed this through what we call a medical model, basically treating deafness as a brokenness, a disability that needed to be cured or fixed. But there is a totally different way to look at it, and it's called the cultural model. This shifts the perspective completely. It views deafness not as a loss at all, but as a totally unique human identity, complete with its own incredibly rich language and culture. Unfortunately, that older obsession with fixing deafness, well, it led to a really dark era. Back in the late 19th century, prominent figures, even scientists like Alexander Graham Bell, actually feared the creation of what they called a deaf race. It's hard to believe, but this tragically led to the eugenics movement. It was a terrible period where deaf women were forcibly sterilized to stop them from having children. On top of that, there were aggressive, widespread campaigns launched to ban sign language entirely, literally forcing deaf people to try and act like hearing people. Let's move on to Section 2, the rise of deaf culture. Now, just like those early Jamaicans fought for their spiritual freedom, the deaf community fought back against this oppression. And they did it by forming fierce, protective cultural bonds. This gave rise to this amazing concept known as deaf gain. So instead of looking at deafness as hearing loss, deaf gain argues that experiencing the world visually is actually a superpower. I mean, it creates this rich, highly expressive, three-dimensional language that offers a completely unique way to connect and build community. It's a gain, not a loss. And because the hearing world, and sometimes sadly, even their own hearing families, just couldn't communicate with them, deaf individuals naturally sought out each other. They kind of had to. This created an incredibly tight-knit subculture. For many people, the deaf community isn't just a friend group. It's quite literally considered a second family. It's where they truly belong, it's where they get their news, and crucially, it's where they explore their faith.
Which leads us right into Section 3, the complex history of missions.
So when Christian missions first started interacting with the deaf community, it created a really complicated and sometimes painful legacy. Early hearing missionaries often operated out of this Victorian paternalism, meaning they essentially treated deaf people like helpless children who needed to be pitied and saved by the hearing world. But thankfully, over time, this shifted heavily towards deaf empowerment. This was a real game changer. This is when deaf people realized, hey, we don't just need religion handed to us by outsiders. We need to lead, we need to evangelize, and we need to experience God for ourselves. Honestly, the old way failed because traditional church is, well, it's entirely built for hearing people. Think about it for a second. The spoken sermons, the music, the terminology, literally the whole shebang is based on sound. So, for a highly visual culture, this made faith feel totally foreign. It created a massive barrier that made deaf individuals feel completely estranged from the actual message. It just felt like faith was something exclusively meant for hearing people. All right, moving on to Section 4, deaf liberation theology. Out of all that historical estrangement came something truly beautiful. Deaf liberation theology. This is the powerful, unapologetic belief that God created deaf people perfectly normal, exactly as they are. In fact, if you ask around, many deaf kids will confidently tell you that they will still be deaf in heaven. They absolutely celebrate their identity.
They assert that they do not have some spiritual defect that needs clinical pastoral care or a cure in the afterlife. It is a profound message of ultimate acceptance.
And finally, Section 5, the Jamaica Deaf Village. So, what does this all mean for where you're heading in Mandeville? Well, to put things into perspective, today there are an estimated 54,000 deaf Jamaicans living on the island. That's a massive group. And even though Jamaica is a highly religious country, the deaf community has historically been isolated from the island's spiritual and economic life, mostly because of that persistent language barrier and the deep-seated historical marginalization we just talked about.
To help bridge this gap, an organization called the Caribbean Christian Center for the Deaf, or CCCD, was born. It started out pretty small, actually, just a little fellowship in Kingston back in 1957. Then, in 1962, they moved operations to a campus in Knockpatrick. But the real breakthrough happened in 1984. That's when they launched a massive, totally game-changing undertaking, the establishment of the Jamaica Deaf Village.
Now, the Jamaica Deaf Village, or JDV, isn't just your standard mission outpost. Not at all. It's a 100-acre, totally self-sustaining ecosystem built entirely around deaf empowerment. They've got vocational factory training right there on site, so deaf Jamaicans can earn a living and actively participate in the local economy. They're homes for deaf families, and right at the center of it all is a church where deaf people worship, lead, and connect, entirely in their own visual language. It really is Jamaican self-determination and deaf culture in action.
So, as you gear up for your trip, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. Knowing this complex history of marginalization, understanding the absolute beauty of deaf gain, and seeing Jamaica's fierce legacy of independence, how are you going to engage with this culture? Will you focus on building a true partnership, or is there a risk of falling back into that old trap of paternalism? Remember, you aren't going there to fix anyone. You're going to learn, to partner, and to experience a vibrant, visual second family. Let this history be your guide.